Hello, everybody. Today we have a very special author interview. These interviews will take place regularly on this channel and are a way for readers and writers to hear from authors not only about their books, but how they came to create those books in the exact way that they did. I hope you enjoy. Okay, I'm very excited today to introduce our wonderful author of the moment. This is M. Christine Benner Dixon. Christine is a novelist, short story writer, essayist, and poet. Her 2025 debut novel was released on the 1st of April. Entitled The Height of Land, her book follows the quest of a young man torn between spiritual longing and commitment to his community's survival in a harsh landscape. Her main character, Red, sacrifices everything to study the long-lost words of the gods. He does not know that he is reading the poetry of Lucille Clifton, Ḥáfiẓ, and Walt Whitman, as well as the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, and Tao Te Ching. In a world reborn from catastrophe, these ancient texts take on new meanings. To seek such things is to court peril. Belief in the gods is forbidden, but Red is desperate to know the gods, and he is not searching alone. Forsaking all that is familiar, Red pledges himself to a clandestine church in the city and falls in love with a charismatic priest. But Red may lose both love and faith in defying the church for the sake of a friend. Have the gods truly abandoned the earth, or just Red? What kind of answer can he receive when he is lost in the words to ask? When he has lost the words to ask. So, to start us off, this genuinely sounds like such an interesting book, and I have to ask, like, what inspired you to write this story?
Yeah, well, it was actually another book that was my inspiration, as so often happens. We inspire each other. So I had tickets with my friends to this reading series here in Pittsburgh, and the guest for the month was Reza Aslan, who was talking about his book God: A Human History. And that book really gets into that question of like why humans gravitate to the idea of God and form and create religions around that idea. And it really got me thinking about like what kind of a God or what kind of a religion would modern people, right? People who have the technology that we have, or at least the knowledge of that technology, what would they create, if they didn't already have a religion? So I did a lot of soul searching, literally, right, trying to figure out what was that draw for me to the idea of God when I was religious, and what has happened to that yearning now that my beliefs have shifted. And so it's really no coincidence that Red goes looking for the gods that or like in books and he ends up finding poetry and identifying the voices of the gods in literature. That's very much my story as a student of literature, finding that sort of sacred spaces that I was familiar with in terms of religion in other places, and finding that that was actually also answering that same call and yearning. And I think, yeah, there is something really holy in the creative expression of the human soul. And so this book was one way to kind of explore that in in an imagined future.
No, I can definitely see where you're going with it because it's so fascinating. I mean, I think we've all had that experience where we've encountered a piece of art, whether that's a book or a poem or even just a painting, something where we just look at it and we feel that just connection. That there's not a word for it necessarily, where you just see it and you
Yeah.
feel something.
Yeah.
And holy definitely could come into that where you're just like, this means something to me spiritually in a way that might not make sense to anyone else, but this means something to me. How do
Yeah.
you touch that like when you're writing that though? Like how do you bring that across to your characters and your readers as well?
Well, I mean, so much of the book is driven on that sense of yearning,
Yeah.
right? That so Red is growing up in this world where religion has actually been forbidden because they saw it as part of the reason that the world fell apart and the collapse of civilization. But he still has this feeling of yearning, of desire for something, whatever name we give to it, whether that's
Mhm.
holiness or divinity or God or transcendence or whatever, and so that's where I kind of try to really sharpen what is that thing, because I think the language we have around those religious terms is really weighted and is really, carries a lot of the legacy of all of the religions that this world has produced. But his yearning is something that I could kind of describe in metaphor, and I could describe in kind of emotional terms and imagery, and really like focus on that sense of desire for something beyond, for
Right.
that world of the spirit. And so then when he identifies it, when he finds it and recognizes the voice of the gods in Lucille Clifton's work or Walt Whitman's, it's a little easier to bring back in that religious language, and frame it in that way. Once we've already sort of put our hands on that feeling of desire for whatever, that nameless thing.
Yeah. No, I definitely can understand how you would get there. I mean, gods is such an interesting word. And I think we see that a lot, especially like in fan cultures where people get really latched on to a certain artist or popular figure or something. There's almost a deification now of like how people are like handling their relationships with their parasocial relationships with the people that they really care about. When you're using this word, especially like with things like for Walt Whitman, who's a human and not a god, how do you deal with that deification of humanity as a God figure in a way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you. Like the idea of God is so powerful, and it has already migrated out of religious context into other parts of
You
our
rap God, you're this, you're that.
exactly, right. And so I think we're already primed for that. And, gods, though, like in the traditional sense, are given this power of creation and destruction and morality. And of course, artists are dealing in those same things as well, right, as creative people, but also as like tearing things apart and reframing and creating these moral visions. And so I think that there is some of that same work. I'm not saying I wouldn't, say that artists are gods. I mean, we could argue that point all day long about what does that actually mean. But the fact is, we use art and the work of artists, as well as religious gods, as the repositories for some of our most important myths and virtues. So they're doing some similar work. Um, and it might not be that way for everyone. If they're not growing up in a religious context, that God word might not have the same weight, but I think culturally it does. But it's interesting because in my book, In the Height of Land, the artists themselves are actually somewhat lost to the past. Red doesn't ever know anything about the poets he's reading. He doesn't know about their context, about their world, except for what little scraps he has sort of pieced together from his learning. But he finds something in their words and in the work of their words that has that mark of divinity or transcendence or whatever you might call it. And I think that's what draws me to art too, right? As that sacred repository for our stories. And I think it's a bad idea to deify individual artists. We will be disappointed. But heck, look at all the like stories we have of actual gods, within pick your mythology, and we're disappointed in them too. So that's part of the God cycle also. But looking for those stories of grace and sin and the stories that make us who we are, those are found, like those do come from the gods in our religious mythologies, and they come from our artists, in contemporary society, I think.
No, absolutely. And you touched on something a second ago, which is something that I see a lot with my history work, where who's writing the history, who's engaging with the history, what the purpose of engaging with that history in that specific way. All these different narratives create a different association or different implication of how people are actually engaging with whatever the event is. And so it's interesting that he's divorced, shall we say, from that history so that he's encountering these narratives without the external context.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that when as a writer, you know the context, but when you're trying to create a
Mhm.
scene where your characters don't know the context, how do you engage with that as a writer?
Yeah, well, it's fun. It's a little bit of a puzzle for me too, and I like that, like saying like, okay, so what little scrap could have made it through? And sometimes I'll do that where I'm kind of like picking out little individual pieces of a story or little shreds of reality that they can point to without full understanding. But I see this happening all the time. Um, I'm also like I have an academic background. I started out as a scholar of 19th century American literature, so I'm really tuned into the way that people use the past to make decisions about the present and also the ways they misconstrue the past. There's a wonderful Mark Twain piece, and he was sort of the main focus of my academic work, where he has kind of people of the future talking about the past and the way that they're just like jumping from era to era, and they've got like Shakespeare hanging out with you know Abraham Lincoln, and they like, sure, they were contemporaries, right? Like he recognizes this is what people do all the time. Looking back, we sort of compress the picture of the past and pick out the things that make sense to us, and that help us build our story of ourselves in the present. And that's not always based on literal fact. That's a story, right? The story is always cutting out some pieces. You don't say everything. You're just focusing on this one little bit. And we see that in American history. Look at how people talk about the Civil War, and how that shapes their understanding of today and literally like right now. Um, People will point to like Abraham Lincoln's ardent belief in preserving the Union as this model for how, we're in these divided times and should we like focus back, do that kind of fight for the Union. Some folks point to that war as like a cautionary tale about states' rights. And then other people are going to see that the Civil War as part of these like endless compromises that were made on the literal backs of Black folks before, during, and after the war, and going into the present, and conclude that the country is not yet really out of that period, that we are still inheritors of the problems and the strife and the oppression that we were dealing with in the 1860s. Um, and that this failure to bring about racial justice to the victims of capitalism is the root of our current turmoil. So we all have different stories that we tell about the past, and the story that we choose has this huge impact on what we do. And it can sound very objective of like, oh yes, well, if you look back at the past, this is what we learn. We have to remember that we are always the lens. We are always choosing which story we accept as part of ourselves and as part of our vision of ourselves.
Something that is also involved with that is like, what are the stories that survive with us? Which are the ones that just kind of we forgot about or are put by the wayside or aren't picked up? I mean, one thing that in just the description of your book, you have a wide range of cultures and a wide range of time periods of the things that he picks up. How do you choose which ones to highlight in your book as opposed to, I mean, you can't cover everything, but how did you choose which ones that you do include in your book?
Yeah, well, that was a mix of like some of it was just choosing the ones that I'm familiar with because I know that I can work with those. And so as a 19th century American scholar, Walt Whitman ends up featuring very prominently. Big surprise, everybody. But also the Christian New Testament is something that I employ at different points, and that's something that I'm um, comfortable doing. And I use that also in a critical way, which I feel comfortable being critical of a text that was part of my heritage. But I also, I am conscious of and really do believe like the world that I am most familiar with is not the only vision of the future. And so I wanted to make sure that when the wisdom of the past comes to read, it is not just the wisdom that I have been steeped in, which is predominantly white and predominantly Christian. And so I'm pulling in the Bhagavad Gita, I'm pulling in Lao Tzu, I'm pulling in some of these other texts that I am not as familiar with. So I, with read, am kind of encountering them absent their context, which is, I acknowledge that I am not making religious statements about these texts, but I also don't want to imagine a future that is so narrowly circumscribed by my own experience. But that's always a tricky thing, when we're employing works that come from cultures that are not our own. How do we do that respectfully and in a way that doesn't presume knowledge that we don't have? And this was my attempt to do that.
Did you work with other people while you were fine-tuning this, and how was that process put together?
Yeah, and when you say like work with other people in this process, you mean the whole book process or specifically in employing
Well,
these
yeah,
texts?
I'm familiar with the publishing process, so I know
Yeah,
you definitely worked with other people. But
yeah.
like specifically in this, when you're dealing with stuff that you're not as familiar with, where did you get your sources of information? Where did you get your feedback or your consultation while you're trying to make sure that you were doing this in the way that you have talked about?
Yeah, so I did reach out to friends who have more direct cultural experience with some of these texts, to get a sense of like how well this is engaging those texts. And that was helpful and it was informative to me to get feedback to say, okay, so here's where this does or doesn't look like Taoism, for instance. And that was helpful, just to kind of have that perspective because I cannot generate that. And so I'm enormously grateful to the folks who did give me that feedback. And then as I was going through that process, I was also realizing that, yeah, like I really am not meaning this text to be a commentary on those texts, right? That is intentionally not saying this is the correct view, right? In the Height of Land, Red's community has made a blanket decision about all religion being culpable for the suffering of their ancestors. I don't necessarily think that readers need to agree with that. I think that they can see that they are misrepresenting, that they are misunderstanding how things have come about, or they might agree. That's up to them. But this sort of lifted out of context reading of these words, was part of what I was going, like actually wondered, hey, how do we cut off from our legacy and what wisdom trickles through? How do we make new sense of it? I don't necessarily recommend that as a way to engage religion. It's all sort of thought experiment. And so I found it really valuable to balance both the existing understanding of those texts and their context, and then also felt comfortable, um, saying that this is an imagination space that, has no knowledge of that what else is there if we look at that without that context. Um, and that's
No,
what I
I
was
think that's
thinking.
that's really interesting, and I think it's a really deft way of managing it because if you're not saying this is how you need to do it, it gives you an opportunity. It's like if you're introducing something for the first time, you're going to make mistakes. Red's going to make mistakes. He's not going to be able to like, I know this text. I am a priest in this religion. I know what to do. Like it's always going to be that interpretive thing. So it gives the readers a chance to experience something for the first time, but also the characters and helps the story move forward.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
something
and
sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, I'm going to add too that, in this imagined space, this is all happening in a future language that does not exist yet. So nobody is reading this in the text in their original language. Red is translating everything out of the ancient tongues into his own. So there are mistakes that I also intentionally work into that process. And sometimes those mistakes, as we've seen in translations of the wisdom literature of all time, sometimes those mistakes take on a life of their own, and they become meaningful to the person, even if they were not there meaningful in the original. Those mistakes become meaningful because that's what we do. We're meaning making creatures.
It's so important to highlight that too, because translation in general, I mean, everything has a different context. I mean, I think R.F. Kuang really highlighted it in Babel very recently, where it was just like every word has multiple meanings, and when you translate something into a different thing, you get a completely different, maybe not a completely different, but a slightly different interpretation, which could have some sort of personal reaction that could be completely different from one thing or another. You see it all the time with, like, for instance, the translation of Disney lyrics, where one country has one language that's translated one way and then it's completely different in another context. Even
Yeah.
between variations of Spanish, you see that with Spain Spanish lyrics versus Mexican Spanish lyrics. Like they differ and they have a different implication as a result. So like the translation thing is such an interesting idea of how would he translate it, and is that translation really accurate or
Right.
more just his own personal interpretation rather than a direct translation?
And that those questions get so much more fraught when we're talking about religious literature. He is also doing that with poetry, and
Just very
we,
hard.
which is very hard. But I think that like one of the things I truly believe is that like every time someone reads a poem, they are doing the work of translation, even if they're reading it in the work in the language that it was originally written, because our experiences are different and our contexts are different. When I read Walt Whitman today, I am translating it into my own experience and into my time. And it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. And it's not going to mean the same thing between individual readers. And so that work of translation that's literalized in the book is very much part, I think, of our experience of literature all the time. And for me, coming from a very religious background where the Bible was seen as, the infallible word of God, the realization that I came to as I began to get more into my literature studies that it is always in translation because of the human element. Um, and it was always written by a human. It was always, like that, the human part of the literature means that it is sort of infinitely variable. And that I think is actually beautiful and not threatening. For me, once in my life, that would have been threatening. Now I actually see that as making it more rich and more abundant and more available to us as true wisdom literature because we can put ourselves into it and it becomes it's a little different in everybody's hands.
That's a huge part of all engagement with art, this act of continual translation, continual interpretation. Um, for instance, I remember distinctly getting required reading in school where you do the work because it's the assignment, you have to do the work, but I hated the book and never wanted to look at it again, just wanted to get the assignment over, walk out the door. Years later, I'd pick up the book again and be like, this is actually a pretty good book. I understand why it was assigned to me. But at 12, 13, 14, it didn't have the same impact at 30. Um, and the moments of your life, they change. And I
Yeah.
think that's a really similar thing that you experience with poetry, with literature, with religion. The moment in your life will change how you perceive that experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious, where does the title come from? The Height of Land is such an interesting title, and it's a little bit poetic to my ear as well. So, how did you come up with it, and what was the inspiration for the title itself?
Yeah, well, the poetry is very important to me, and so the fact that it's a beautiful phrase um, was kind of a ringer. But it's actually a technical term that refers to the boundary between watersheds.
Okay.
Um, so if you think of it's like a ridge on a mountain, and if water falls on this side of the height of land, it goes down into this watershed, into this river. If it falls on the other side, it goes down into a different watershed, into a different river. And now those rivers may eventually join up, but for kind of that, for what that term literally means, it is just about that boundary between the watersheds. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful phrase, so that when I landed on it, I was like, oh, thank you, I will take that. Water imagery is present throughout the novel, and that sort of decision point felt really important to me, right? That idea of like, you can go here or you can go here, and that kind of determines the flow of your life. So often, I think we walk those boundaries in our lives that allow us to kind of run one direction or another, but we have to choose who we want to be. And, this really is a coming of age novel. Red is 19 at the beginning of the novel, and he's for the first time making these decisions for himself and about himself that are based on what he believes and longs for, as opposed to what his parents and older siblings and everything, what they are giving to him. And those decisions are monumental. They are, even when they feel small, they're huge. And when they're huge, they're also still huge. And that kind of decision point, that height of land that he inhabits, and has to decide which river he gives himself to. And that's also literal. There are rivers, two rivers that he sort of engages with in the book, and deciding which river is his is sort
I
of,
liked the phrase you used earlier when you said it was monumental because it sounds like there's multiple decisions. So each one is another monumental choice. So here you're up a new height of land here. Next decision, new height of land. And you're constantly going
yeah,
down, making different pathways down this monument of life that he's
yep.
going through. It sounds like it's a I wish I had that type of poetic thought process because it sounds like you really like hit the nail on the head with that one. It sounds great.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel like it feels really honest to me too about how I feel about my own life. That yeah, like I know that there are times where I could have been someone, something else. And I'm not, and I don't regret, I don't ever think that well, it's not productive to look back on those moments with regret, but just with realization. We have chosen our path. Sometimes it's chosen for us, but it's still like there's a definiteness to we went at this point this way and not that way. And this is where we are.
And where the river is flowing moving forward.
Yeah.
Water has such a prominent force in a lot of art. Why did you specifically choose water for this story and use it in the ways that you've described so far?
I don't know that I consciously chose it. I think that is just one of those things. There's a good reason that it is
Yeah.
shows up in a lot of art is because, as the activists around the pipelines remind us is that water is life, right? That this is our very literal life source, that there's almost no other thing, barring perhaps oxygen, but that's harder to write about, um, that we would die without. And it's beautiful, right? Like we also recognize there's something about it that whenever we stand beside a body of water, a stream, whatever, we kind of pause and it touches us. And I don't know what that is. There is this sort of mystical connection that we seem to have with water, and I'm just embracing it. Yeah, I don't think I really made a conscious choice, but I was sort of recognizing as it sort of came out that water is throughout. I really like too that it has such movement, that
Yeah.
water, of course, can be stagnant, and that's a problem. But when it's moving, that's what brings us life and carries us forward. And it has all these multiple uses, whether it is, watering our plants, and he is a farmer, so that's important. But it's also transportation, and it's also energy. They have hydro channels that they're creating electricity with it. So water is woven into almost every part of our lives, and into Red's life too.
One of the themes that we've been discussing is that this is set in a postmodern, post-apocalyptic world. When you're writing a post-apocalyptic world, how do you build that world? So you've already brought up things that we're familiar with, farming, water usage, even the construction of going to find churches and stuff like that, finding meaning. But how do you create that in a world that's so different from what we currently actually do live in?
Well, these days it's not too hard to let your imagination drift into a post-catastrophe world. Um, I think that we are constantly thinking about that. At least some of us are. Um, but I like to think about the future, not necessarily just in what's going to go wrong, but what can go right as well. The catastrophes, right? Climate catastrophe is facing us every day. We have kind of sort of the political issues like that are front and center right now. I think a lot of us are feeling that really strongly, that things feel very chaotic and very tenuous, and that there is the potential for some big upheaval politically. But we also have the planet itself is facing catastrophe, and it's really hard to look at these kind of layered disasters that are facing us, and in some cases are completely inevitable, um, and go, whoa, that's going to be horrible. And a lot of post-apocalyptic literature really lets us sit in the horrible part of it where it is chaos and it is war and people are just scraping by and barely surviving. And I was really curious about what the next post, so post apocalyptic, how do we like who gets through that period and how do we get back to being a people who thrive and not just survive? And so the Chart River, which is the town that Red lives in, they're kind of like on the edge of the barrens. They're really kind of scraping out of life, but they've come from cities and things that are doing better. And when we see like the things that their culture values are all based on what got their ancestors through. And it is not violence. It is not scraping out like you're kind of like only for me and no one else, right? It is actually about community. The people who made it past the warring stage were the people that came together, supported each other, look, figured out how to preserve the knowledge of the past. And that's one of the values they have too, is they go through whatever old books they find and they try to, pull out the wisdom and the knowledge that they can find in those and pass it on to each other. What their obligation is to teach each other what they know. And so this really strong community focus is how I envision us making it through any disaster, big or small, right? And that I think that we are constantly facing disasters, and there have been apocalypses that have happened already, right? That for different people in different places, those catastrophes have been survived. And so we actually are living in a post-apocalyptic world, and learning the wisdom of like what is it that actually makes people uh, able to thrive again. And I think that that's community, and I think that that is being really judicious about what do we choose to carry forward with us, and in being very thoughtful and reflective about those things. And so that's sort of the world that I wrote. I also like figured, electricity is kind of easy to make. It's not rocket science. We're not having to put anyone on the moon, but we can do those kinds of things. Radio, those things we can figure that out. We might lose Zoom, but we'll still have radio. Like with that, you'd have to you'd have to work pretty hard to completely get rid of some of those technologies. So I do let some of those technologies go forward. I'm not looking at like a completely, pioneer out in
Blank
the
slate back to the Neolithic
yeah,
period.
right.
Well, I think it was the anthropologist Margaret Mead who said that the true sign of actually like culture and community was finding a skeleton that had a broken femur, but then that person survived many years after the fact because without community, that person would have died. They wouldn't have been able to get food, water, whatever. But the fact that they had a broken femur, that it healed and mended, and they can continue surviving many years later, meant there were people around to help support that person's survival. And so I think the focus on community, the focus on coming together, and that innate humanness of, yeah, someone is hurt, someone does need help. How can we address that and build that community? I think that is a very human thing to talk about in a post world, because there's always going to be community somewhere. It might not be the best community in the world. There might be many problems, but a community does form because humans, by their nature, are social creatures.
Mhm. Yeah, and I will say too, there's going to be a temptation for some readers to idealize the community that has formed in Churt River and Red's world. I would caution you against that because we always carry problems with us too, right? We very rarely is there actually just a cleansing fire that sweeps the world, right? We carry the scars and we carry the kind of the burns of that fire as much as we carry that kind of that cleansing power that it has. So yeah, like they make mistakes too. And but I think that's part of being human and learning how to roll forward and accommodate and grow and change, even after we've landed on something that works, is really important.
I think that's probably for me, having not had a chance to read your wonderful book yet. For me, I think that's such an important thing to think about because it is so easy to idealize. It's so easy to be like, the grass is so green over here, and not think of well, maybe it's not so green over there, or all those other issues, because you're trying to find a sense of purpose and you're trying to find a way. It's like the community's great. We don't need to leave the community and not question the community, when maybe you should, because nothing is perfect. There's always a way that you can make things better and more equitable for other people involved.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I have to admit, I'm unfamiliar with the genre of metaphysical fiction. For people who, like me, are not familiar with that genre, how would you describe it? And what other books could you point them to, if they wanted to explore more in this particular space?
Yeah, I was actually I loved that you sent me this question ahead of time saying that Google Books had listed it as metaphysical fiction. And I'm like, oh, what a great category. I didn't know that it was being called metaphysical fiction. But I totally approve. I love it. You know, metaphysics concern themselves with the realm of the mind or the spirit, perhaps. And that's very much true of this book, even though it has plenty of literal physics that play with climate change and storms and floods and weather and so forth. But the driving force of the book is that, you know, that desire, Red's desire to meet a god and to connect with the gods. Um, so he loves talking about the soul and the possibility of a reality beyond this one. So yes, that's kind of the metaphysical quest that I think makes that a great category to apply to this book. You could probably make a comparison to something like The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, though I have to confess that that was not my favorite book.
Mine
Um,
either. It's okay.
okay,
You're
good.
in good company.
I know a lot of
My poor
people
mother
love
has
it.
given me 4 copies of this book.
Oh,
She's given me the graphic novel. She's given me the Spark Notes. She's tried so hard. I'm so sorry for fans of this book. It was not the book for me.
I know, and I don't want to like tell anyone you're not allowed to love that book. Of course, you're allowed to love that book. I didn't, but I think that that probably fits in the same category. So if you're as you're kind of thinking about what that category is, but another book that I would actually point to that feels a little closer to where this book lives is Lydia Millet's A Children's Bible. That's actually set in the midst of an apocalypse as the collapse is happening and kind of deals too with that, you know, that legacy of belief and faith and religion and forming a new religion as the times are changing and how these ideas do or do not keep up with the changes that happen around us. I actually read Lydia Millet's book, A Children's Bible, after I wrote my first draft of The Height of Land. And it was like, whoa, it felt like a prequel to my book. Like, oh, yeah, it's like as if the children of her book end up being the ancestors of mine several hundred years later. But that felt like they kind of live in some of the same space.
That's such an exciting feeling when you come across that. It's like, ah, yes, these two, they can be married together. Perfect.
Yeah.
I'm very curious to read them both together and seeing what the transition is between them.
Yeah.
What did you find most inspiring about like the idea of writing in this way where you're talking so much about the soul and the thought process going through?
Well, I mean, I think that as is true in kind of the best of circumstances when we are creating, it was an opportunity to be really honest with myself
Mhm.
about my own spiritual journey, which is one that is, you know, is complicated. My family, my grandparents, I mean, my parents do. My father is a pastor. You know, my mother is a deeply devout woman who dedicates her life to helping people in the name of her faith, and I think that's beautiful. I respect that so much, and I also my beliefs have changed a lot since I was young. And so finding a way to put a kind of a narrative around that sense of kind of I don't kind of believe in keeping with my community and how that change happens and how it is both painful and beautiful and leaves us with something at the end that we're not bereft of belief when our beliefs change. So that was really kind of a healing part of the process for me. It's also, I mentioned this in several different places in the world. The main character, Red, shares a lot in common with my older brother, Jason. And so that was fun too, to kind of bring little pieces of his personality into the book. And then I actually had a launch event at his farm in Virginia. So the being able to stand on my brother's farm in front of, Massanutten Mountain
Oh.
and read these words in that space with the chickens like crowing in the background really
As they do.
felt, yes, I was like, okay, peak experience, put a pin in that. That was lovely. Yeah. So I think that the personal nature of this book, and as a first book too, right? This is my first novel. It felt really important to say that, to be able to kind of like announce my place in the fiction writing world with something that feels so heart on the sleeve. This is my story.
Um, so you've talked about what you came away with writing it. What would you like your readers to walk away with when they're finished reading your book?
Oh man, I really I don't ever want to like tell readers what they need to take away. I want them um, to be turned back to their own minds and lives and hearts and like consider what they want for their lives. And maybe it's this, like if a god appeared to you in a vision right now and charged you to seek, what would you seek for?
Oh,
Right?
that's a
Like
good question.
that's and that's exactly like that's as much information as Red gets when the god shows up and says seek, and he just has to go figure out what he's actually looking for. And I think that's a question that I hope lingers for readers. What would you seek for and where would you find it? I think that pursuit of something that's beyond us, there's nothing like it. And yeah, I do wish that for people, for anyone who's willing to go after it, it can truly, you know, push you down one side of the mountain or the other.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Um, I am curious, and it's totally okay if you're not able to share. I know that when I'm writing, there's always that one scene that stands out to me of like, this is my scene. If you can share or you can give us a little bit, what is your one scene that when you think of the book, that's the first thing that comes to mind is that moment?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it's an image because, image is so important to me in my writing. I also have, kind of write a lot of poetry. So my writing tends to kind of blur sometimes between the poetic and the prosaic. Um, and so that a lot of scenes that come to mind are really just like compositions and settings. But I think what epitomizes the novel is the moment where Red is standing on the height of land, right? That ridge line between the watersheds, and he's up there um, trying to decide which side belongs to him and which one he's going to choose. And his heart is filled with yearning in both directions, right? Yeah, I think that's like the word of the book is like yearning, right? He has to choose one. His heart is speaking to him and he's listening and he's up there, he's begging like the stones and the grass to help him make up his mind, but the stones have barely moved for centuries. And the grass is busy making seeds and blowing around in the wind, and they don't have a good answer for him. The answer has to come from inside of him. And it does, right? That is where he has to pull from, and he steps up to the plate.
That sounds fantastic. And I can definitely see everything coming together in that moment. That sounds really fascinating. And I can't wait to get a chance to actually get to read it. Before we end our interview today, I did want to ask if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just a word to writers because I know that it's a lot of the folks who are going to be tuning in, and that is like you're totally not married to the first thing you write. Um, I have no intention of writing this book again in another form. This one is, kind of check. I've done that. It's kind of, yeah, that's my little heart book. I love experimenting with form and genre. I have a cyberpunk novel that's in my drawer right now. I have a Shakespeare space opera that's out on submission. And I'm working on two other books right now, one that's best described as like reverse historical fiction, and one that's a collection of nature writing essays that written with a friend of mine. It's a follow-up to our first collaboration, which was a craft of writing essays, right? So um, I'm not saying it's necessarily great career advice, but I do think that as artists, we can never go wrong in pursuing our yearning, right? Like pursuing our creative instinct, the thing that says, that's what I want to do. That creative instinct is the greatest resource that we have. And we should protect it and nurture it with everything we have. And so not being afraid of like, oh, now I am just a romantasy author, or I am just a, sci-fi author. Like the resource that you have is your creative instinct. So pursue that always.
Just to make this fully full circle, when you're at the height of land, make your choice and go for it, even if you're a
Yes.
little bit nervous. Thank you so much to M. Christine Benner Dixon for talking to us today about her book, The Height of Land. The Height of Land was published on April 1st, 2025, and you can find its purchasing details in the video description below. If you like this content, please hit the subscribe button and leave a comment if you have any additional questions or have a suggestion on what you'd like to see next. Stay happy and healthy. Bye for now.